Hi everybody, Karen Fabian here, founder of Bare Bones Yoga, and thanks for taking a couple minutes to watch my YouTube channel. So I bet you're a yoga teacher, and I bet you're looking for information on anatomy. It's just a guess. However, that's really what I'm about. I am a yoga teacher, as I assume you are, and my niche area of expertise is anatomy. However, it's not really a niche area because if you're a yoga teacher, you're teaching movement, and there is no way around the fact that you've got to understand anatomy. There's no way you can be cueing if you don't understand the anatomy, cueing accurately. You can certainly be standing there saying a bunch of things, however, it's going to be a really different experience for your students and for you if you don't understand anatomy. So everything that I do is focused on sharing anatomy in understandable ways and making it fun and easy to learn, because I know from talking to hundreds of yoga teachers that it's a challenge to learn it, and in many teachers' experience, it hasn't been fun, it hasn't been easy to understand. And so one of my goals is really to change that approach. And I think if you'll look at any of the testimonials on some of my offer pages, you'll see that I've come up with an approach that does make it fun and light. And a lot of the mastery of it really comes from focusing on the main things. Where yoga teachers often get tripped up is they complete their 200-hour training, they realize they didn't really gather enough anatomy information, they don't really know it, they have a knowledge gap there, and then instead of seeking out someone that has an expertise in anatomy, they go off on their own, and they usually go onto the internet, they buy books, they take different hours-based trainings, like a 300-hour training or a 500-hour training, and they somehow think that doing those things is going to fill in this gap. And oftentimes, by the time they come to me and enroll in my programs, they've done several things like that and still haven't filled in that knowledge gap. And as a result, they've spent a lot of time and a lot of money, and they're still at this point of feeling like there's a gap. So all of what I do is focused on filling that gap. So if I'm speaking to you, I'm really glad that you found my YouTube channel, because I know I can help you. So what I want to go over today is a format for understanding postures, and really understanding postures from an anatomical lens. And so this can be helpful because as you're teaching different poses, you'll want to call on the anatomy. However, to learn the anatomy that goes with each pose, it's really helpful to have a system, a systematic template, a roadmap of sorts, so that you're looking at each pose according to the same criteria. It's going to be really hard to learn postures if every time you open a book and look at a pose, it's talking about all these different aspects of that pose. So here what I've got for you is a format to understanding poses. And so we'll look at the name of the pose, the primary action, the key actions of the pose, the muscles at work, meaning concentrically contracting, the position of the joints, modifications you can offer, things to look for like red flags, and speaking to spirit, because even when we're teaching with anatomy in mind, of course we're teaching to people, and of course it's a yoga practice. So there's this whole other area that people are accessing that we want to encourage people to access, that has to do with mind, body, and spirit, and that kind of elusive connection. So our cues can also kind of bring certain things up that spark that level of inquiry and that connection in students. So it's not all about the anatomy, is my point. However, we are going to focus a lot on that, and we'll pick a particular posture to do it with. So let's pick downward dog, because I bet you have some questions about downward dog. It's a common pose we do, so it's one that if I do it here for you, you'll get a good bang for your buck in terms of the time you're spending here on YouTube with me. So let's first, downward facing dog, and let's talk about the primary action. So you can think about primary action as, what the heck is the point of this pose, right? And that's many times what your students are thinking when they are practicing yoga, when you're teaching. What's the point of this? They're struggling, they're hot, they're sweaty, they can't focus, and they're probably dying for you to tell them, why am I even having to do this thing? You know, many times what teachers miss is an opportunity to put themselves in the shoes of their students. And once you put yourself in the shoes of your students, everything shifts in terms of how you present. When you're presenting things from the perspective of you know, how you're feeling in that moment, your need to get grounded, the story going on in your head, you know, kind of limiting beliefs that you may be feeling in that moment, it's really hard for you to teach effectively to your students because you're now in first person, you're teaching from yourself. However, if you put yourself in their shoes, it completely shifts how you present cues. And so this is a perfect example. If you're presenting the primary action of the pose in your cue, for each posture, you're speaking to a question your students probably have. Now there may be more than one primary action. As I come into downward dog, you might say, oh, it lengthens the spine. Oh, it stretches the hamstrings. Oh, it creates upper body strength because you're pressing away from the mat. So any or all of those things would be correct. It simply is a requirement. It simply is my suggestion to you that you offer something and call it out as one of the primary actions of the posture. So as you have them in downward dog, you could say, press away from the mat. See if you feel that that helps you strengthen your upper body. Press your thigh bones back. Take your inner thighs back. See if that helps you tap into the strength of your legs. As you press away from the mat and lift your hips to the sky, do you feel any length in your spine? This is one of the benefits of this posture, creating length in the spine, right? So the verbiage exactly doesn't matter. You're going to customize that to what you're comfortable with. The main idea here is you're cueing them in to the point of the pose, one of them. So the next thing we're going to look at are the key actions of the pose. So this is where we come into talking from action, right? We can talk from alignment, we can talk from anatomy, we can talk from action, we can talk from feeling-based, somatic-based cues. Here we're going to focus on action. So as I have people come into downward facing dog, what are some actions I can ask them to do? Actions are really understandable. So I could say press away from the floor. I could say hug the upper arm bones in towards the head. I could say take the inner thighs back, press the thigh bones back. I could say lift the hips to the sky. I could say pull the belly button in. So any of those things would be highly understandable, regardless of experience, and completely action focused. So the next thing is, now that I've talked about action, let's talk about muscles. Muscles create action across the joint. So here's the key point. You can't talk about muscular actions if you don't know what muscles are at work, and many teachers are out there doing that and they're faking it. Understanding how muscles work, where muscles are, what muscles create what action is absolutely necessary to give anatomy-based cues. You cannot be talking about muscular actions if you don't know what muscles are at work. So I bet you know that the triceps straighten the arms, right? And maybe that's your limited understanding of the triceps. However, that's great. That's something we can start with. It's on the posterior line of the arm. It straightens the arm versus the biceps, which bend the arm. I bring up those two because those are common muscles that people know. So a good example is press away from the floor, squeeze your upper arms, and see if you feel your triceps engage to straighten your arms at the elbow. So that's just a really simple anatomy-based cue that calls into play one of the actions of the muscle when the muscle is concentrically contracting to create that action of straightening the arms. But what about the fact that down dog has a little bit of external rotation? In order for me to cue something like roll the inner eyes of the elbows forward, I need to understand what are the muscles creating that movement, even if I'm not going to call them out. So I've got two in the back, my infraspinatus and my teres minor, and they are external rotators. So as I cue people to roll the inner eyes of the elbows forward, I'm tapping them in to the action of those muscles to create that external rotation at the joint. As I cue people to take their inner thighs back, and maybe even to hug their inner thighs towards one another, I'm cueing them to the action of the adductor complex, the line of muscles that sits on the inner thigh. So adductor longus, brevis, pectineus. a little bit of the anterior glute medius. So those are some, and then of course you probably know the hamstrings. However, the hamstrings are lengthening, right? The hamstrings are lengthening there, so they're not concentrically contracting. So your cues would be more to inquire with your students if they feel the length in their hamstrings rather than the contraction. So then what about things like position of joints, right? So here, the shoulders are in flexion. Not an extension, the shoulders are in flexion. The hips are in flexion, the spine's in extension. The inner thighs or the hips are also internally rotating and are adducting. So those are just some general anatomical terms that refer to the action of the joints. What about modifications or contraindications? So if I had high blood pressure, I probably wouldn't want to do an inversion. If I had glaucoma, I probably wouldn't want to do an inversion. These are not things that are visible to you as a teacher, so unless somebody tells you they have one of these conditions, you're not going to know. This is part of the inherent risk for practitioners or really for teachers to teaching yoga, is that if the students don't disclose, the teachers won't know, right? Modifications though, so modifications, we talked about the hamstrings being lengthened, and the more I press away from the mat, the more I lengthen and potentially bring my hamstrings to their end range. Hamstrings begin on the ischial tuberosities or the sitting bones, and they insert on the back of the knee. So if that's their range, the biggest modification I can do is one you probably know, which is to bend the knees a bit. As I bend the knees, I create slack in the hamstrings themselves. And then speaking to spirit, or let's say things to look for, red flags. So one of the common things you might see is a rounding of the back, like this, versus a lengthening of the spine. And this potentially could have to do with hamstrings that are a little bit too tight, a practitioner that's pushing too hard, and because the hamstrings start on the sitting bones are part of the pelvis affects the position of the lower back, and so that kyphotic back or hunchback can occur. And then the final thing, speaking to spirit, so think about something that you connect with in your own body when you're coming into downward dog. You might connect to the feeling of your fingers spreading. You might connect to those first couple breaths that you take when you first come into that first down dog. You might connect to that feeling of length in your spine or any of those action cues we talked about at the beginning. So these are all good sources for connecting your students or giving your students a cue that helps them connect to that in their own body. It's okay if it comes from your own experience. You just don't want to prescribe it to your students. You want to suggest it. So hey, see if you feel the strength in your body as you press away from the mat. See if you feel a clarity in your mind when you set your gaze at one point. Right? So any of these things are an opportunity for us to shift from the anatomy into the mind-body. So all of these things create the template that we can use to evaluate every pose. And as it turns out, I've done that for you. In my anatomy manual, for every single major posture, I have in the manual this exact breakdown. So this becomes a really essential guide for yoga teachers who want to understand the anatomy of the postures. So you can get this anytime on my website. It's $119 US dollars, and the website is barebonesyoga.com. Now the other thing I'll just mention to you, if all of this is kind of illuminating and interesting, is that sometimes a manual is not enough. And sometimes what people really are looking for, teachers in particular, is more of a learning tool. And so I do have a signature program called the Blueprint Learning Program. This is just one piece of it. However, working like this in terms of posture to posture, talking about translating anatomy to cues, is the main goal of this program. So if that sounds like something, like I was saying in the beginning, that would fill your need to fill this knowledge gap, all you need to do is get on the wait list, and I'll let you know when I open enrollment, which I do every few months. The waitlist link for the Blueprint Learning Program is right on my website as well, barebonesyoga.com. So I'll include the link to the website at the end of this video. If you have any questions, just send me an email. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to click subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Thank you. Namaste.